Welcome back to History Whispers podcast, episode 4. Once again, we're diving deep into the wellspring of ancient philosophy. In a previous episode, we explored the life and teachings of Socrates. Today, we turn our attention to his most famous student, a thinker who not only preserved his mentor's legacy, but also built a towering philosophical structure of his own. Yes, today's episode is all about Plato. And once again, I am honored to be joined by our most savant guest, classicist and philosopher, Dr. Rhys Morgana. Welcome back, Dr. Rhys.
Thank you, Emma. It's a pleasure to return. Plato is truly one of the giants of Western thought, both a devoted student and a radical innovator. His influence is foundational.
Let's begin where it all started, with the world that shaped Plato. Could you paint us a picture of ancient Greece during the time of his birth? What was the political, cultural, and intellectual climate like back then? And how might those early conditions have influenced his philosophical ideas?
Plato was born in 427 BCE in Athens, during a period of great intellectual vibrancy and social upheaval. His birth came near the start of the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict between the Athenian Empire and the militaristic city-state of Sparta. This was a time when Athens, often idealized for its democratic principles, was deeply unstable. The war exposed the fragility of its democracy, and by the time Plato was a young man, Athens had been defeated, its political system shaken, and its people left divided and disillusioned. His family was aristocratic, well-connected, and politically active. Many of his relatives were involved in efforts to overthrow democracy, and some played roles in the short-lived oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants. So Plato's world was not one of calm academic contemplation. It was a world where politics was dangerous, where ideology could lead to bloodshed, and where questions of justice and governance weren't abstract. They were matters of life and death. This context profoundly influenced Plato. He was disillusioned with both the failures of democracy and the cruelty of oligarchy. His search for a just society was born out of the ruins of Athenian politics. And it was through philosophy, especially through the mentorship of Socrates, that he sought a path forward, one grounded not in power or popularity, but in truth and virtue.
Dr. Rhys, we've discussed the turbulence of ancient Athens, a time marked by war, political instability, and the dramatic trial of Socrates. What I find fascinating is that both Socrates and Plato lived through this same chaos, and yet their bond became one of the most defining in philosophical history. So tell us, what was the actual age gap between them, and how did Plato come to be Socrates' student? Is there any historical account or written record that details how their paths first crossed?
That's a great question, Emma, and it opens a window into one of the most significant intellectual relationships in history. Historically speaking, Socrates was born around 470 BCE, while Plato was born in 427 BCE. That puts a roughly 43-year age difference between them. So by the time Plato was a young man, Socrates was already a well-known figure in Athens, respected by some, feared by others, and constantly stirring the pot with his relentless questioning. As for how Plato came to be a student, there's no single document that records their first meeting or formal mentorship. But ancient sources, including Plato's own dialogues, give us a compelling picture. Plato likely encountered Socrates in his late teens, around the age of 18 or 19. Given his family's political connections and status, it's very likely he would have attended gatherings or public discussions where Socrates was speaking. What makes their relationship so interesting is that it wasn't based on formal education in the way we might imagine today. Socrates never opened a school, never charged fees, never lectured from a podium. Instead, he wandered the city, engaging people in philosophical conversation, often challenging them, frustrating them, even embarrassing them. Plato didn't just admire Socrates' intellect. He was drawn to his moral seriousness. Socrates was a man who lived his philosophy, even to the point of accepting death rather than abandoning his principles. So while we don't have a historical document that says this is the day Plato became Socrates' student, we do have an entire body of work, Plato's dialogues, that speak to the depth of their intellectual connection. And through those writings, we can feel how transformative that relationship must have been. For Plato, Socrates wasn't just a teacher. He was the embodiment of philosophy itself.
Dr. Rees, it's remarkable to think that everything we know about Socrates today, his life, his philosophy, even his presence in ancient Athens, survives almost entirely through the writings of Plato. Without Plato, Socrates might have vanished into history as just another forgotten voice. It seems that Plato didn't just study under Socrates, he carried his teacher's legacy forward, immortalizing him for future generations. Am I right in thinking that? What are your thoughts on how Plato preserved and honored Socrates' influence?
Emma, you're absolutely right, and that point cannot be overstated. Our understanding of Socrates is almost entirely filtered through the lens of Plato. Socrates, famously, never wrote anything down. He believed that true knowledge was not something to be stored on a scroll, but something to be lived, questioned, and discussed. So if we're speaking historically, yes, we largely know Socrates through Plato's dialogues. What's truly extraordinary is how deeply Plato honored his teacher. Socrates appears as the central figure in almost all of Plato's early and middle dialogues. In these texts, we hear Socrates interrogating politicians, poets, craftsmen, always challenging assumptions, always guiding others to greater clarity. Plato doesn't just record these conversations, he dramatizes them. He captures the tension, the humor, the humanity of Socratic dialogue. But as we move into Plato's later works, we see a shift. The Socrates we meet in, say, the Republic or the Phaedrus is still Socrates, but he's also something more. He begins to voice ideas that are clearly Plato's own, such as the theory of forms or the structure of the ideal state. In this way, Plato doesn't just preserve Socrates, he transforms him into a philosophical archetype. Socrates becomes not just a person, but a method, a symbol of integrity, reason, and moral courage. So yes, Emma, Plato didn't just keep Socrates' memory alive, he made him immortal. And in doing so, he ensured that every generation that reads philosophy encounters Socrates, not as a distant relic, but as a living force. That's the power of Plato's pen. He turned mentorship into legacy, and legacy into a cornerstone of Western thought.
Dr. Rees, before we dive into Plato's actual philosophy, and I promise we will, I want to pause for a moment on something more personal, something that truly moved me. The death of Socrates clearly had a profound impact on Plato's life. And there's a famous painting, I'm not sure who painted it, but it depicts Socrates on his deathbed, surrounded by his grieving students, reaching for the cup of hemlock. You can even see Plato sitting quietly near the bed, deep in thought. Do you know the painting I'm referring to? And more importantly, how accurate is it? Were all those people actually present at Socrates' death, or is this a symbolic representation? And secondly, as you mentioned in our earlier conversation, Plato didn't stay in Athens after his teacher died. He left the city. Where did he go during that time, and what led him to return and eventually open his own school? If I'm not mistaken, that school, the Academy, is considered the first formal institution of higher learning in the Western world. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and take us through that fascinating journey.
That's such a thoughtful set of questions, Emma, and I appreciate how you've woven history, emotion, and curiosity into it. Let me take each part step by step, starting with the painting you mentioned. First, about the painting. Yes, you're referring to the famous artwork titled The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, painted in 1787. It's one of the most iconic visual depictions of philosophical sacrifice and moral conviction. In the painting, Socrates sits upright and resolute, reaching for the cup of poison, surrounded by his grieving disciples. Plato is portrayed at the foot of the bed, slumped and deep in contemplation, shown as an older man even though he would have been in his 20s at the time. Now, regarding authenticity, it's important to understand that the painting is a symbolic and dramatic interpretation, not a historical snapshot. According to Plato's own account in the dialogue Phaedo, not all of Socrates' closest followers were present when he died. Plato himself actually writes that he was not there due to illness. So while the painting captures the emotional gravity of that moment, and it's powerful for that reason, it's not strictly accurate in terms of who was present. Jacques-Louis David was aiming to evoke heroism, tragedy, and philosophical dignity, not document history precisely. Second, about Plato leaving Athens after Socrates' death. Indeed, Plato left Athens shortly after Socrates was executed in 399 BCE. The city had become politically toxic. The very democracy that had condemned Socrates was not a safe or stable place for his followers. Plato, deeply disillusioned and grieving, began a period of travel, what we might even call a kind of philosophical exile. He is believed to have traveled to Egypt, Cyrene in North Africa, and southern Italy, places where mathematics, religion, and political theory were flourishing in different ways. In Italy, he encountered the Pythagoreans, a sect that deeply influenced his thinking, especially around the role of mathematics and the harmony of the universe. These travels expanded his intellectual world and exposed him to other systems of thought, giving him a broader base to build his own philosophy. Third, the founding of the Academy. When Plato eventually returned to Athens around 387 BCE, he was ready to create something new, a lasting space for philosophical inquiry. That's when he founded the Academy, a grove of olive trees near the shrine of hero Academus. And yes, Emma, you are absolutely right. It is widely considered the first formal institution of higher learning in the Western world. The Academy wasn't a university in the modern sense, but it was a place of structured dialogue, study, and mentorship. Students from all over the Greek world came to study there, including a young man named Aristotle, who would later go on to tutor Alexander the Great. The Academy remained active for nearly 900 years, long after Plato's death, and became a cornerstone in the transmission of philosophical knowledge. So, in a way, Plato took the pain of losing his teacher and transformed it into an enduring legacy, not just in words, but in a living, breathing institution. That's the kind of resilience and vision that makes his story so powerful.
Dr. Reese, it's honestly heartbreaking and also deeply moving to hear how Plato transformed such grief into something so enduring. And it makes me wonder about something I once heard, though I'm not sure if it's just a stereotype, that philosophers tend to be a bit emotionally distant or even hard-hearted. But from everything you've shared, Plato's journey seems anything but cold. He felt deeply, didn't he? And speaking of that journey, when Plato returned from his travels and founded his school, we call it a school now in modern terms, but what exactly was it called back then? Does any part of it still exist today? I mean, are there ruins, a museum, some preserved space where this historic academy once stood? Also, you've mentioned about the Aristotle, who was Plato's student in his school. What were other prominent students and notable philosophers who studied under Plato? And one last thing I've always been curious about, why did Plato choose to build his academy outside the city in an olive grove? Was there a reason he wanted to be away from the urban life of Athens?
Emma, I'm really touched by how you frame that. You know, that idea that philosophers are hard-hearted or emotionally detached is a stereotype that's been around for centuries. And I understand where it comes from. Philosophy demands a certain distance, a kind of discipline. We train ourselves to question everything, even our own feelings, and sometimes that can appear cold from the outside. But if you look at someone like Plato, what you actually find is a soul that was deeply sensitive to beauty, to injustice, to love, and especially to loss. The grief Plato felt after Socrates' death wasn't just intellectual, it was soul-shattering. And instead of retreating into cynicism, he responded with something tender, the creation of a space for learning, for dialogue, for truth. That, to me, is not the act of a hardened heart, but of someone who loved so deeply that he wanted to keep his teacher's voice alive in every generation that followed. Now, about the school, the Academy. Plato's school was called simply the Academy, named after the grove in which it was built, a sacred area dedicated to the hero Academus, located just outside the city walls of Athens. It was more than a school. It was a community of thinkers, students, and teachers engaging in philosophical inquiry, mathematics, science, ethics, and more. And yes, Emma, some parts of it still exist today. The ruins of the Academy are in a public park in modern-day Athens. You can walk among the remains, see where lectures might have been held under the trees. It's not preserved as a full museum, but there's a plaque and some stone remnants that give you a powerful sense of standing in the birthplace of Western intellectual tradition. It's both humbling and beautiful. As for students, Aristotle studied at Plato's Academy. He joined at the age of 17 and remained for about 20 years. Other notable students? Certainly. There was Speusippus, Plato's own nephew, who succeeded him as the head of the academy. Xenocrates,
another important figure in early Platonic thought, also studied there. These thinkers helped evolve and preserve Plato's ideas well after his death, ensuring the continuity of his intellectual legacy. And finally, why outside the city? In an olive grove? That's such a poetic question. Plato didn't want the distractions of public life, the noise of politics, or the busyness of the marketplace. He believed that philosophy required peace, contemplation, and a connection with nature. The olive grove, sacred and serene, offered just that. It symbolized wisdom, nourishment, and timelessness. By placing his school there, Plato was making a statement that truth isn't found in the crowd, but in quiet thought, in slow conversation, under the open sky. So no, philosophers are not hard-hearted. They just speak a different language, one of reason, yes, but also of enduring love for wisdom, for justice, and for the fragile, beautiful journey of the human soul.
That's amazing, Dr. Reese. Honestly, the knowledge you bring, not just the facts, but the depth and the clarity, it's something I, and I'm sure our listeners, deeply appreciate. Now, coming back to something that's still hovering in my mind, we've touched on this briefly, but I'd love to go a bit deeper. You've already mentioned that Plato's Academy taught a range of subjects. Could you clarify, were those the only subjects that were taught there, or were there more? Can we say with confidence that those disciplines made up the full curriculum of the Academy? And more specifically, I want to ask about Plato's relationship with mathematics. I remember reading, though I can't recall the exact wording, that there was an inscription about geometry at the entrance of the Academy. Could you tell us what that sentence was and why Plato considered mathematics, particularly geometry, to be such a vital pillar of philosophical education? And finally, one thing that really fascinates me, you mentioned earlier that the Academy was named after the grove of Academos, but in modern English, the word academy now means any place of learning, like a school or an institution. Is it true that our word for academy today actually comes from Plato's original academy? If so, that's a pretty amazing legacy. Please shed some light on that as well.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's always a pleasure to be here and to share this knowledge, not just because it connects us to the past, but because it reminds us how ideas, once shared, don't fade, they grow. Every thoughtful question opens up new insight, and that's exactly what philosophy is all about. Now, coming back to your wonderful question, there are several rich threads here, so let me take them one at a time. First, regarding the subjects taught at Plato's Academy. Yes, in a previous response, I touched on the core disciplines taught there, but let me clarify further. Plato's Academy wasn't narrowly focused on just one branch of knowledge. It was a multidisciplinary learning center, more advanced and holistic than anything that had come before in the Western world. The subjects we know were taught there included mathematics, particularly geometry and arithmetic, which Plato considered essential for training the mind. Astronomy, not as stargazing, but as a science that revealed the harmony and order of the cosmos. Philosophy, covering ethics, metaphysics, logic, and epistemology. Dialectic, the art of structured reasoning and intellectual dialogue. Political theory, reflecting Plato's concern with justice, governance, and the role of the state. Music and harmonics, viewed as mathematical in nature and connected to the soul's harmony. Possibly even physical education, in line with the Greek ideal of a balanced body and mind. So yes, those were not just side topics. They formed a comprehensive educational program. The Academy aimed to cultivate philosopher citizens, individuals capable of governing with wisdom and virtue. Second, about the famous inscription and Plato's reverence for mathematics. You're absolutely right, Emma. There is a legendary phrase associated with Plato's Academy. Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. While we can't say with certainty that it was literally carved over the entrance, this idea has survived through multiple ancient references, and it reflects Plato's belief that mathematics, especially geometry, trains the mind to perceive eternal truths. Geometry doesn't rely on sense perception. It operates in the realm of pure forms, which resonated deeply with his philosophical concept of the forms, perfect, abstract ideals that exist beyond the physical world. In the Republic, Plato even outlines an educational path for future philosopher kings that begins with mathematics and moves upward through dialectic to the understanding of the form of the good, the highest truth. So for him, math wasn't just useful, it was spiritually and intellectually essential. It purified the intellect, making it ready for philosophical insight. Third, about the origin of the word academy in modern English. Yes, and I absolutely love this part of the story. The word academy, as we use it today, whether in reference to schools, academic disciplines, or learned societies, does indeed trace directly back to Plato's school. The name academy came from the location where Plato founded his school, the Grove of Academos, just outside the city walls of Athens. This grove was considered sacred and peaceful, far removed from the noise and distractions of urban life. Plato chose it not just for its beauty, but for its symbolism, a place of reflection, contemplation, and connection with nature. Over time, the word academia came to refer not just to the place, but to the institution itself. And from there, it entered Latin, and eventually modern languages. So yes, every time we say academy today, we're invoking the spirit of Plato's original vision, a place where minds come together to seek wisdom beyond the shadows of illusion. A truly remarkable legacy.
Excellent, Dr. Rice. Truly fascinating. Now, coming back to what is perhaps the heart of it all, Plato's actual philosophy. I think it's safe to say that everyone listening today, whether they're longtime learners or just curious minds, wants to understand what Plato really stood for. So, could you help us unpack that? What are the core ideas that define Plato's philosophy? Are there distinct notions or categories within his philosophical system? And how many of these major ideas have been preserved or recognized as part of his enduring legacy? Kindly shed some light on the actual philosophical foundations of Plato in a detailed way.
Absolutely, Emma. And I'm so glad we're arriving at this point. Because while the stories, the academy, and the legacy are fascinating, it's Plato's ideas, his actual philosophy, that are the heart of his enduring impact. Plato's philosophy is broad and deep, but it revolves around a few core notions, each one building upon the other to create a comprehensive vision of reality, knowledge, society, and the soul. Let me walk you through the most important ones. 1. The theory of forms or ideas. This is arguably Plato's most famous and foundational idea. He believed that the world we experience with our senses is only a shadow of a deeper, truer reality, the world of forms. A form is a perfect, unchanging essence of something, the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of a circle. Everything we see in the physical world, beautiful faces, just actions, round objects, are imperfect reflections of these perfect forms. This metaphysical belief had enormous implications. It meant that truth was not found in appearances, but in deeper, invisible realities accessible only through reason. It also formed the foundation for his views on knowledge, ethics, and education. The allegory of the cave. While this is technically a story, it encapsulates Plato's entire worldview. In it, prisoners live chained inside a cave, seeing only shadows on a wall, believing them to be reality. One prisoner escapes and discovers the outside world, light, trees, the sun, and realizes the shadows were mere illusions. This represents the human condition. Most of us live in ignorance, mistaking appearance for truth. The philosopher is the one who escapes the cave and sees reality for what it truly is. But returning to tell the others is dangerous. They may not believe him, or worse, they might reject him. This allegory isn't just poetic. It is Plato's vision of enlightenment, education, and the responsibility of those who understand truth. The tripartite soul. In the Republic, Plato explains that the human soul has three parts: reason, the rational, truth-seeking part; spirit, the passionate, courageous part; desire, the instinctive, pleasure-seeking part. A just soul, and by extension, a just person, is one in which reason rules with spirit supporting it and desire kept in balance. This model becomes the basis not only for his ethics, but also for his political philosophy. The ideal state and philosopher kings. For Plato, politics and philosophy were inseparable. He believed that the chaos of Athens, the corruption, the execution of Socrates, stemmed from unwise leadership. In his ideal state, outlined in the Republic, society is divided into three classes: rulers, philosopher kings, guardians, soldiers, and producers, farmers, artisans, merchants. The philosopher kings are those who, through years of study and moral development, have grasped the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and justice. Only they are fit to rule, because only they understand what is truly best for the people. The form of the good. Above all other forms, Plato placed the form of the good. This was the highest truth, the source of all other knowledge and existence. Understanding the good was like, for Plato, seeing the sun in the allegory of the cave. It illuminates everything else. Plato believed that knowledge without the good is dangerous, and that only by aligning ourselves with the good can we live ethical and meaningful lives. The doctrine of recollection. In dialogues like Meno and Phaedo, Plato introduces the idea that all true knowledge is actually remembered, not learned. He believed the soul existed before birth and encountered the forms, and that learning is simply remembering truths the soul already knows. This ties into his view of the soul's immortality and its journey through different lives. Education as the craft of the soul. Plato was deeply committed to the idea that education is not about filling the mind with facts, but about shaping the soul. True education turns the soul away from shadows and towards light, from ignorance to wisdom, from opinion to knowledge, from illusion to truth. So, to summarize, Emma, while Plato's works are vast and varied, his philosophy can be distilled into these 7 core notions. 1. The theory of forms. 2. The allegory of the cave. 3. The tripartite soul. 4. The ideal state and philosopher kings. 5. The form of the good. 6. The doctrine of recollection. 7. Education as the craft of the soul. Together, they form a powerful, unified system, a vision of human potential, ethical responsibility, and the eternal search for truth. And that, I believe, is why Plato still speaks to us today.
Dr. Rees, what you've just shared, especially the allegory of the cave, it's incredibly powerful. I honestly can't believe that over 2,000 years later, Plato's ideas still feel so deeply relevant. That image of people mistaking shadows for reality, it resonates so strongly with the world we live in today. Which brings me to my next question. In this modern age, a world shaped by technology, information overload, social media, and digital realities, how can we meaningfully connect Plato's philosophy to the present day? What does his ancient wisdom offer us in navigating today's complexities?
That's such an important question, Emma, and I think you're absolutely right to sense how strangely prophetic Plato's ideas feel in our modern context. His philosophy may have been born in the streets of ancient Athens, but its heartbeat is still felt in our digital world today. Let's start with the allegory of the cave, since you mentioned it. Plato imagined people chained in a dark cave, watching shadows on a wall, believing those shadows were reality because it was all they had ever known. Now, pause for a moment and think about modern life. How many of us scroll through curated feeds, absorb filtered content, and construct our views of the world based on headlines, influencers, algorithms, and entertainment? Social media, digital news, even the metaverse. These are today's shadow walls. They reflect something, yes, but often something distorted. Plato's cave isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's a condition of modern consciousness. His message? Step outside. Seek the light. Question what you think you know. But Plato's relevance goes beyond the allegory. In a time of information overload, he reminds us of the difference between opinion and knowledge. The internet offers endless data, but data is not wisdom. Plato teaches us that true knowledge requires discipline, contemplation, and moral integrity. It's not just about being right, it's about being good. In education, Plato's vision is more vital than ever. He believed in nurturing the soul, not just training the intellect. Today, we often emphasize skills, speed, and specialization. But what about character? What about critical thinking? Plato urged us to educate not just to produce workers, but to cultivate ethical, thoughtful citizens. And even in politics, his cautionary views remain striking. He warned that democracy without education could lead to demagoguery, that leaders chosen for popularity, not wisdom, could destroy a state.
And while Plato was no fan of unchecked democracy, his point was clear. Good governance demands deep understanding, not shallow approval. We see the urgency of that lesson playing out across the globe today. And lastly, in a world that glorifies appearances, Plato urges us to look deeper, to question surface-level truths, to pursue the good, the true, the beautiful in their highest forms. That pursuit might feel idealistic in a fast-paced, transactional culture, but it is, in fact, our most human calling. So yes, Plato speaks powerfully to our age. He reminds us that the answers we seek about truth, identity, meaning, require not just access to information, but a deeper transformation of the soul. And that message, I think, is more urgent now than ever before.
Absolutely, Dr. Rees. And hearing all of this really makes me think about our younger generation today. We're living in a time when so many young people are deeply immersed in social media, constantly connected to their screens, often overwhelmed by images, trends, and instant validation. In light of Plato's philosophy, especially his emphasis on truth, reflection, and the dangers of illusion, what lessons do you think our modern generation, particularly the youth, should take from his teachings? How can Plato help guide them toward a more thoughtful and meaningful way of living?
That's such a timely and heartfelt question, Emma, and one I think about often, especially when I looked at the way today's youth are growing up in a world so different yet strangely similar to the one Plato observed. Let's begin with what Plato would likely say if he walked into a modern home or a classroom and saw dozens of young people staring into their phones. I think he would gently but firmly say, "You are living in the cave." Not because technology is evil or screens are inherently wrong, but because they can become the shadows we mistake for reality. Plato's philosophy teaches us that the pursuit of truth requires effort, silence, even discomfort. In today's digital world, everything is fast, filtered, and fleeting. But truth, real, lasting truth about the self, about others, about the world, comes slowly. It comes through introspection, dialogue, and learning to question what you see and hear. To the young generation, Plato would offer several key lessons. 1. Don't settle for shadows. Social media shows you the highlights, the performances, the edits, not the truth. Don't mistake the curated version of someone's life for the whole story. Plato would say, step out of the cave. Look for the real, the whole, the enduring. 2. Cultivate your inner life. Plato believed that the soul is the most important part of us, not our body, not our reputation, not our followers. He would urge young people to ask, what kind of person am I becoming? Am I feeding my soul or just my scroll? 3. Choose reflection over reaction. In a world of likes, shares, and instant responses, Plato would remind us to slow down. Think. Ask why. Seek understanding before judgment. Philosophy at its core is not about having opinions, it's about forming them carefully, ethically, and rationally. 5. Seek the good. Not just what's popular or trending, but what is good, truly good, for you and for others. Whether it's in relationships, studies, careers, or activism, Plato's ultimate question was, what is the good? That's a question every generation must ask for itself. In a way, Plato's philosophy is a quiet rebellion against the noise of modern life. He calls young people, and all of us, to look past distraction, past illusion, and towards something more meaningful. And in doing so, he offers not rules, but a lifelong invitation to seek wisdom, truth, and purpose. And that, I believe, is one of the greatest gifts we can pass on to the next generation.
Absolutely, Dr. Rees. Such wonderful thoughts, as always. And now, as we begin to wrap up today's episode, I'd love to ask you the question I always ask you at the end. A bit of a tradition now. What is your favorite quote by Plato, and why does it resonate with you personally? What meaning does it hold in your life or your understanding of philosophy?
Thank you, Emma, and I truly love that this has become our tradition. Because in a way, quotes are like windows into a philosopher's soul. And for Plato, whose words have echoed through millennia, choosing just one is always a challenge. But if I had to pick a favorite, The one that stays with me most deeply is this: the heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. It's a simple sentence, but it's packed with urgency and moral weight. What Plato is saying here isn't just about politics, it's about responsibility. He's warning us that when people of wisdom, compassion, and thoughtfulness withdraw from leadership, when they shy away from speaking up, from guiding others, from engaging with society, they create a vacuum. And too often that vacuum is filled by those driven not by justice or reason, but by ego, fear, or ambition. This quote resonates with me because it challenges the idea that the thoughtful person should remain above the fray, separate from the world's messiness. Plato is saying, no, you must step in, even when it's difficult, even when you doubt yourself. Because if the wise remain silent, the foolish will gladly speak. And on a more personal level, it reminds me that philosophy isn't a retreat from the world. It's a deeper engagement with it. To live well, to lead well, to serve others, that takes courage, and it takes clarity. And Plato's words continue to remind me of that every day.
What an amazing and truly enriching conversation this has been. I know I've deeply enjoyed every moment of it, and I'm certain our listeners feel the same. Dr. Rees, your insights, your knowledge, and your ability to connect ancient wisdom with modern life are absolutely mesmerizing. On behalf of all of us here, thank you so much for giving us your time and your voice today. It's been an honor.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's always a pleasure to join your podcast and to share my thoughts on these great minds of history.
And with that, we come to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much to all our listeners for joining us on this thoughtful journey through the life and philosophy of Plato. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, and we'd love to hear from you. In the comments, let us know which philosopher you'd like us to explore next with Dr. Rees Morgana. Until next time, take care of your mind, nurture your soul, and remember, history is never just the past. It's the first chapter of who we are. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of History Whispers.